Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webcast, Saying Goodbye, How to Navigate an Unexpected Board Director Departure. You may ask a question throughout the webcast by using the Ask a Question button located under the slide. Simply type your question into the box and hit Submit. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to David Shaw. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dagmar. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Shaw, the editor and publishing director of Directors and Boards, and I'll be introducing and closing today's webinar. As Dagmar noted, there is certainly time for questions during this presentation. You can ask them at any time. If they're relevant to an earlier part of the discussion, we'll bring them in right away or save them toward the end. This webinar will last no more than 60 minutes, and the presentation and all supporting material will be emailed to participants after the webinar. Today's webinar is on a topic that can have some real repercussions, how to navigate an unexpected board director departure. Many companies have little in the way of formal succession plans in place to cover an unexpected director departure, and that can easily exacerbate an already stressful situation. And meanwhile, should a director's actions require removing a director from the board, there aren't really clear-cut guidelines for when and how to terminate a director, and the actual decision is subject to interpretation, pushback, and even potentially litigation. To address this thorny topic, I'm joined today by three wonderful speakers. First, Dennis Kagan. Dennis is a noted high-technology entrepreneur, executive, and board director. He has founded, co-founded over a dozen different companies, taken some of them public, been a CEO of both public and private companies, a venture capitalist, a consultant, and a professional board member, having served on over 60 fiduciary company boards, including 8 public boards. He's in the IT Hall of Fame, and in 2013, the NACD and the Dallas Business Journal elected him as one of the inaugural 12 outstanding directors in North Texas. Dennis's book, The Board of Directors of a Private Enterprise, was released in April of this year and is the authoritative perspective on the widest range of private company governance issues. In fact, in that book, there's a chapter on exactly the topic that we're discussing today. Kathleen Camilli is currently an independent director on the board of UniFirst Corporation, the third largest uniform rental company in the U.S., with facilities in Europe, South America, and Canada. She's also on the board of Tactile Finance, an early-stage tech startup, and was also an independent director on the NASDAQ-listed Mass Bank board. Kathleen was named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the top 5 economic forecasters. She called the turning point of the tech bubble in 1999 and 2000, as well as the ensuing recession in 2001, and that earned her a number of number 1 performing forecaster ratings by the Wall Street Journal and Business Week. Dottie Schindlinger will be our moderator for today's session. Dottie is Diligent Corporation's governance technology evangelist and promotes the intersection of governance and technology as a recognized expert in the field. Diligent is the leading provider of secure corporate governance and collaboration solutions designed to promote improved performance for boards and senior executives. In her role, Dottie provides thought leadership on related topics through digital and print publications, conference presentations, and workshops for board members and executives globally. Dottie?
Thank you so much, David, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone's having a great day. We're going to be talking about this really interesting topic of unexpected director departures today, and really we're going to touch on the 4 main reasons that a director would depart unexpectedly, obviously a resignation or a termination, and certainly talk a bit about the process of termination and how difficult that can be and what are the circumstances under which that can happen appropriately. And then also, there can just be unexpected life events or election turnover, and we're actually seeing quite a bit more on the election turnover side, especially over the last few years as activist shareholder activity has increased and certainly investor pressures are having an impact on how boards are thinking about, the succession planning and the composition of their boards. So to get kind of started with thinking through this topic, I want to share some of the data that was released very recently from PricewaterhouseCoopers' annual Corporate Directors Survey. This survey comes out every year just about this time, and the 2017 version was really quite interesting. For the last 5 years, up to 2017, there's been some consistent numbers in terms of directors reporting that they think perhaps a colleague on their board should be removed from the board for one reason or another. That number has been about 35% or a little less for the last 5 years in a row. Interestingly, this year, that number jumped up to 46% of respondents, which was really quite surprising, although maybe it shouldn't have been so surprising, because what we are hearing from directors is that they are feeling quite a bit of pressure, particularly from investors and activist shareholders, to make some changes to board composition. So when they were asked what are the main reasons they believe a colleague should be removed from the board, the top reason this year was oversteps the boundaries of his or her oversight role at 15% of the respondents. And that replaces what has been the primary reason given in past years, which was arrives at meetings unprepared to engage in the meeting. And what's interesting is that number one reason has now fallen to number 6. So the other reasons that we see here are reluctant to challenge management, which is a kind of a new response for this year. Interaction style negatively impacts board dynamics, which is also a new response this year. And then advanced age and lacks appropriate skills and expertise are basically at about the same percentage levels as they have been for the last 5 years or so. So we're starting to see not only the number of people responding that they think there's a director that should be removed from the board increase, but we're also seeing the reasons they're giving kind of change over time. So that's sort of interesting. Another set of findings from this year that were fairly revealing had to do with succession planning. So when they were asked about these reasons that they think someone should be removed from the board, we also try to gauge a bit about what level of tenure the directors have on those boards, and then how satisfied are they with their peer performance. So for those that said that they believe that someone should be removed from the board, of that group, of that 48%, 53% of those have less than 2 years board service. So I'm sorry, excuse me, I'm saying that wrong. So 53% of the directors that had less than 2 years of board service said that a director should be removed. So it seems that the longer someone serves on the board, the less likely they are to feel that a peer should be removed from the board. So again, what we think this is indicating, and it'll be interesting to talk about with our panel today, is this is, again, sort of an indication of the pressure that incoming new directors are feeling, and also the pressures that they're feeling from activist shareholders and from investors. And then if we take a look at a couple of other pieces of data that I think will give us a good jumping off point for today's conversation, we also, this is just repeating what I said here, that basically investors are absolutely pushing boards to take action, particularly on the results of annual board assessments. And we're seeing that dramatically change. So in years past, when people were asked, did you make any changes based on your board evaluation this year, the vast majority of people said no. And so really that was leading us to kind of believe that board evaluations were just not serving their intended purpose. They were not kind of getting at the underlying issues and allowing boards to take action and make significant changes based on the results of those surveys. But this year, that seems to be different. So 68%, so quite a large majority, have said that they are doing something different based on last year's evaluation results. That's up 19% in 1 year. So really some very interesting and different findings from years past on this survey. And so now what I'd like to do is invite our panelists to kind of join this conversation. I want to start with Dennis Kagan. Dennis, do you want to give a little bit of background about your expertise in some of these issues? I know that you've recently just written a book on the topic of board governance. Can you talk a little bit about your experience around unexpected director departures, and then I'll ask Kathleen to introduce her experience as well.
Well, my experience goes over a wide range of companies, both public and private, but mostly private. And there's even among the public ones, my experience doesn't represent substantial investor pressure, as the study alludes to. The investor pressure that my experience represents is really from large investors like venture capital firms and large individual investors, former founders, things like that. So that kind of pressure on directors is a little bit different than ISS, Glass, Lewis, et cetera. But I think there's more willingness these days to recognize when directors are not contributing to the overall benefit of the company. And in terms of the pressure on them, I kind of look at it from two sides. One is if you're on a board and there's a director that's inhibiting the performance, whether it's a lack of preparation, whether it's falling asleep, whether it's, you know, their personality, whatever it is, then if that degradation in board performance becomes a topic of conversation among large investors, among regulators, anybody, it's a negative image for the entire board. So no director wants to be on a board with a negative image. And on the flip side, it really does serve to reduce in one way or another the positive impact that the board can have. And so I think it's becoming more and more popular to try and fix that. The old, you know, the old excuse that I've heard for many years is, well, we're not going to mess with it now. They only have a year to go before their term expires. That's just not satisfactory anymore. There's no reason to go a year or even a month. Once you've finally determined appropriately that a director isn't performing properly, there's no reason to wait at all and exacerbate that impact. So that's my comment.
Dennis, thank you so much for that. And Kathleen, I want to give you a chance also to introduce a bit of your experience in these issues, and then I'm interested to hear, you know, your thoughts on what Dennis has just shared with us in terms of the idea of, you know, one director potentially changing the dynamic of the full board in a negative way, and there being less patience these days for directors to just wait that out. So why don't you give us a bit about your background, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about some of Dennis's comments.
Sure. So unlike Dennis's experience, my experience is only on public company boards, and most often when I've seen a director removed, it's because of reason number 3, their interaction style negatively impacts board dynamics. So, and I think the reason that there's less willingness to tolerate that now is just because of the economic environment that companies are operating in. We just don't have time to wait it out. You have pressure coming from activists. You have comments coming from stakeholders and from shareholder services. So I think there's less of a willingness to tolerate a squeaky wheel who's out of place and not really willing to roll up their sleeves and work in a collegial manner. For me personally, I don't join boards of directors where I feel there is not a collegiality, because overseeing the operations of a large public company is important business to the shareholders, to the employees, and to the management team. So I really, an out-of-place director really has no place.
Well said. Well, so it's interesting. I think we both have, or we all three have a lot of agreement on the panel of you know, the importance of making sure that the board composition reflects not just the right sets of skills and competency areas, but the right dynamic so that the group can function really effectively. So I want to start, you know, talking a little bit about some of the questions that we prepared for today, and then I also want to just remind those that are dialing in, we would love to hear from you. So please make sure to send your questions through the Q&A box in the control panel on the webinar system. We'd love to see those, and we'll be taking your questions a little bit later on in this discussion. But I want to just start by talking about some of the best practices. I think you each bring very unique experiences to the table. Dennis, I'd like to start with you. What really do you think are the best practices? And I think maybe talk a little bit from the perspective of private companies, if you would, in terms of developing a director succession contingency plan.
Well, public companies have, even though there may not be any legal limitations to the size of the board, there are certainly cultural and investor implications to the size of the board. But a private company typically doesn't have the same kind of pressure to keep the board at a certain size, whether that's large or small. And so they have a lot more flexibility in grooming prospective directors, meeting with prospective people that could be directors, because they could add an additional one if they wanted to with relatively little public implications. The biggest thing that I've seen over the years is the evolution of boards preemptively developing qualifications matrices or skills matrices, and beginning to take inventory of what skills are represented on the board and what skills are critical to the business that really aren't present in adequate volume in the management team and the board collectively. What's important to the success of the company in terms of expertise or experience or connections or insights, whatever it might be? What's important to them that they don't have enough of already in their existing governance structure, and developing that matrix to expose that so they can start looking for directors that may fit that and provide a broader base of governance input. The other thing that's important is as companies grow, they can outgrow directors. And directorship is not a lifetime occupation. And so I think it's important for directors to go in with the understanding that at some point, if you're a big company, maybe not, but a smaller company, you may go into a different phase of development, different phase of ownership, and so it may be time to part ways so that another director can be added that brings a better fit in skill sets and so forth. And then the last thing I'd say is that private companies, it's generally speaking, it's a little bit easier to deal with problems proactively because they're privately held and it's their business, except with exposure only to their direct shareholders or even just their controlling shareholders, and so they can act preemptively. And so, in my opinion, there tend to be fewer emergencies and much less scrutiny over the way they handle things. So that's sort of my input on that.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting. And Kathleen, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how those best practices would differ in any way in the public company setting. And then I'd also love to ask you about any sort of liability that the board or the company might potentially face in an unexpected departure.
So I think it's always important to have a deep bench in all your committees. So I serve personally on the audit committee and compensation of my two public company boards, one in Canada, one is in Canada and one is in the U.S. And we obviously have audit committee chairs, but everyone who serves on the audit committee knows that they would be expected to step in the event of a departure of the chair or departure of any other person on the committee. In terms of succession planning, that's a subject for the Nom and Gov committee, and on my boards we review who would step in, who are potential people we're looking at or thinking about to add to the board for various roles. On one of my boards, we're looking for a technology person, so that continues to come up. In my opinion, the most important skill sets on the board are on audit. So we need someone with a public accounting board background to interface with the public accountants with deep knowledge and financial expertise. And, then on the comp committee, presumably someone who's dealt with CEO succession as the leader of the committee and dealt with compensation issues. That would be it for my side in terms of what I've experienced. In terms of liability, I don't really think about liability because boards should always be prepared. I mean, that's their job. They're serving all the shareholders, all the stakeholders, so they should always be prepared. So I don't think about liability.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And so I'm interested to Dennis, continue on with you and ask a little bit about your thoughts on board refreshment initiatives. I know we recently did another webinar with directors and boards on this topic, and it's certainly a bit of a sensitive one. I'm curious to know how you feel about board refreshment initiatives as a possibility of kind of creating a more resilient board and ensuring rotation of leadership to continually refresh the perspectives on the board. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, and some of this is personal, and of course some of it relates to me and my board seats and so forth. But I'm not in, and of course with public boards it does tend to be different as well, as Kathleen can get into. But I'm not a fan of mandatory term limits and mandatory age limits. And of course, being an old guy myself, of course that's a little bit self-serving. But I'm more concerned about the performance of the board and the possibilities for new ideas, fresh ways of looking at things to the benefit of the company, and the extent to which a board gets complacent versus adding a catalyst to the board in the form of a younger or board member with different knowledge set to shake things up a little bit. So I'm much more concerned about the changing environment and the changing needs of the company than I am an aging director or somebody that's been on the board. There's controversy about the advantages of frequent refresh, like a 2-year term or something like that, because a lot of people will tell you that after a couple of years, particularly on a complex business, board members are just beginning to really get integrated, get to know the system, being able to look beneath the covers through and with some transparency and not miss some of the things going on. And so refreshing them too frequently, you're really losing that knowledge base. But I think that a program, so me constantly reviewing the matrix, constantly having discussions, strategic discussions about what new skill sets are required, what new experience might be required to the benefit of the company, and taking a proactive, healthy view of it. And in some cases, you may replace a director that's doing a perfectly good job, but it's just not the job you need done right now. And nothing insures against departures. That's a whole different story. But you can insure for the best possible performance of those that you have. And then I think something you mentioned earlier is the effect of constant evaluation and reevaluation, always interviewing new potential directors, and pruning and upgrading are all good practices.
Great, thank you. And Kathleen, I'm interested to know your thoughts on the topic of board refreshment, but I also wonder if you could address a little bit about what's happening in public companies around rotation of board leadership. So if you could talk about sort of refreshment and board leadership changes at the same time, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so on my Canadian board, we do leadership refreshment, and it's a welcome development. It gives people who are serving on the committees an opportunity to be in the leadership role and to gather the committee together outside the board meeting, and then to present at board meetings. So I think that's a good thing. It doesn't always occur on every board I've sat on, but I can just say in the case of my Canadian board, it has been something that they pushed. I do want to say a couple of words about about activism and activists in general, and I think my perception perhaps as a younger board member as to why this is happening. I think that the old way of thinking of directors joining boards and staying on for life, after their retirement is really a thing of the past. Directors who join boards are there to help the company on its strategic direction and on serving all the stakeholders. And I can understand the activist position when companies tend to languish, when they're not returning good returns to shareholders, why they take the positions that they do. So directors have an obligation to show up, to be prepared, to not serve on too many boards, to be mentally engaged in the business of helping the management team run the business. And I agree with Dennis. It's not at all about age. I served on a board of directors where there was a gentleman who had been on the board for 40 years, and I will assure you that he was the most engaged. He happened to be the lead director. He was the most engaged of all the directors on that board and asked the most astute questions and had seen that company, that public company, through many ups and downs, many business cycles, many acquisitions. So he had a wisdom to lend to the board that others just couldn't contribute. A couple of words on skill sets. I do think that, particularly in this environment of disruption, companies being disrupted, you do need to constantly refresh your skill sets. Aside from the basic skill sets that we all need on boards, you do need to be thinking. If you don't have board members who are willing to climb a steep learning curve on technology, which I think everybody should be willing to do that. But if you don't, you should think about adding somebody on from the technology industry. So
I want to give a shout out to that. Yeah, amen to that, Kathleen. I also just would love to ask both of you, and maybe Kathleen, I'll just start with you, and then Dennis, if you want to just chime in very briefly on the idea of using classified boards or classifications of board members as a succession planning strategy. I know that seems to be something that is, in some regards, kind of going away, but I'm just curious to know, if you think that that's a viable refreshment program to put in place.
So what do you mean by classification?
So just meaning, having specific terms and classes of directors that rotate at different rates.
Okay, so I serve on one company where we have a staggered board, and I know that there's been a lot of discussion about that not being a favorable way, but it works well for this particular company. I don't really have any other commentary. I don't have a broad enough experience to answer that, so I'm going to pass on that one.
No problem. Dennis, what are your thoughts?
Well, of course, in a public situation, you have to have term limits because you have to have regular voting by the shareholders. I think that the staggered boards has become much more popular with activism, as you would well recognize. I think you sort of have to have that. What your terms are and how you handle it is really more to do with the culture of the company and the kind of pressure that they may be getting or not getting from various classes of shareholders. In terms of classification, there are oftentimes many board members who are mandated a board seat by virtue of various investment terms or anything else, and that's sort of where activist shareholders get on some of the big public boards. It's a mandated concession that they're making to these people that are buying up large blocks of stock. But save that, with a private company, I don't feel, my own personal opinion is, and anybody's entitled to an opinion, is that having mandated term limits when there's a very unified controlling board set of directors is kind of a crutch that's unnecessary. If somebody's not doing their job, then you have the opportunity to get rid of them. No muss, no fuss. So why go through the mandatory process? But that's just a personal opinion, and I think that's really it can be very workable either way. But I wanted to get back to an earlier point that Kathleen made a moment ago. Case in point, in 2000, I co-founded a company in 1997, and in about 99 or 2000, give or take, I recruited a board member, and he said, well, look, I just can't join that board right now. I'd love to, but I can't because I'm on 4 other boards. But talk to me in a couple of years, and if the opportunity is still there, I'd love to join the board then, because he said, I'll be reaching mandatory retirement age of 72. And that was in 2000. So in 2000, I said to him, okay, let's do this. Why don't I put you on the advisory board now? And then automatically, you let me know when you're off those boards and you can handle it. We'll add you to the fiduciary board. And he said okay, and he was a fairly active advisor. But a couple of years later, he said, okay, I'm off those boards. Well, he had retired after 20 years. He served on the boards of General Motors, Raytheon, Hewlett-Packard, and Hughes Electronics. And he remained on the boards of Harvard University and Caltech. So he joined my board, which we still have the company. He's still on the board. He joined at 72. Okay, that was 17 years ago. He is still probably, including me, the best board member we have on that board, and he's 87. So yeah. Case in point.
I really couldn't agree more. And I think I want to now start to shift the conversation a little bit to go back a step, Dennis, to something you were just beginning to talk about a moment ago, and that is the topic of director removals. I think I'm starting to kind of get the sense in terms of your thoughts around the best practices for director removals when those are necessary. But maybe you could dive a little deeper on that issue for us, if you don't mind.
Well, just to be funny, the best practices, the first thing I'd boil it down to is fast. But that's kind of tongue in cheek.
Yeah, don't wait.
Yeah, don't wait. It ain't going to get any better in most cases. Now, obviously, in fact, just of interest, this same board member was that I was just talking about that a moment ago. He was also the board member that was tasked with addressing some concerns that Harvard had with a certain president at the time, and he gave him a couple of warnings he was picked by the board, say, go talk to this guy. He gave him a couple of warnings, and he didn't listen. He continued to do the things he was doing, and he was later removed as president of Harvard. And so you have to take adequate precautions to rectify the situation, which with a little less impact than escorting somebody out under guard, and that is give them the opportunity, assuming that everybody agrees that this is something they might respond to. Best practice would be have an offline discussion with them, not a confrontation, but an offline discussion saying, hey, this isn't working. Can we change this? And then if you don't get compliance with that, then, of course, you've got to move. So first best practice is avoid it if you can rectify the situation. That doesn't mean put up with it. That means rectify it. So that's the first thing. And situations vary widely and why anyone would want to remove one. But as we've talked before, the most common reason is there's just a mismatch with a certain director in the cultural approach. It's not everybody falling in line. It's not a bunch of yes people, but it's a bunch of people that have put their own egos aside and realize that board directorship is a team sport to a certain extent, that they want independent ideas, but they have to be respectful of their other colleagues. And that's, from my experience, that's where most people get sideways. So best practice summary, it's fast, it's by mutual agreement. All of the other people, including controlling shareholders, if that's appropriate, need to agree that this is the right thing to do. Doing it without incident, and hopefully with a strong replacement near or on the horizon, those are what I consider the best practices in that situation.
And so I think that's really interesting. Kathleen, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I think Dennis has brought up a couple of good points in terms of, when, to maybe try to avoid if possible, but when it's clear that a removal is necessary, not to wait and to do it quickly and by consent. And so I'm curious to know your thoughts about that. And then also, if you could put into your comments any regulatory issues that might come up, particularly in the public company context, that need to be considered in a removal situation.
So I think the only, for a public company, if you're removing somebody whose skill set is critical to the board, in other words, so let's take as an example somebody who is the financial expert on the audit committee, you have to make sure that you have a backup. So that just goes to your Nom and Gov committee, always reviewing the director's succession plan as well as the CEO's succession plan at least once a year, if not more. So with respect to removing directors in general, I would concur with everything that Dennis said. Most importantly, make it fast. In my experience, it's usually the lead director who takes charge of this after consensus among the other directors. So the lead director will go and talk to that individual about what's not working. And in my experiences, usually they will not be there at the next board meeting. But again, I can't stress enough that as Dennis mentioned, it's really, this is a team sport. This is not about ego. I think some people who join boards think of it as the capstone to their career, but this is really a very collegial environment. You're supposed to be a person who has strong opinions and independent views. You're supposed to bring them to the board, but to work together with the other board members to advance the strategy and the direction of the company for the benefit of all the shareholders. I just keep reiterating that.
I think that's really well said, and I like the idea of, really reminding everyone that board governance is a team sport. It's really not about individual star athletes, and so I'm curious to know that team sport approach, though, in the case of removing a director, is that, yes, everyone sort of has to come to the table and make the decision together, but when the actual removal takes place, what are your thoughts, Kathleen? Is that really just the lead director sitting down one-on-one with a director? Should there be more than one person involved? What does that look like in your experience?
In my experience, it's always been the lead director who does that after consultation with the rest of the board. I don't know what Dennis's experience has been or other people's experience, but usually it takes, usually the lead has the responsibility for that.
Dennis,
I would
what
say,
do you think? Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say obviously it depends on the chairman, whether it's the chairman CEO, whether it's an executive chairman, independent chairman, whatever it is. But typically, if it's if it's an independent director that you're replacing, then the presiding director or lead director would be appropriate. If it's not an independent director that you're letting go, then probably the executive chairman or the chairman or even the CEO, if they're also on the board, might be the best choice. It really depends on the circumstances. I have a friend who I tried to get him on a board, and at the time he was retiring from a company that he was working for, and I tried to get him on a board. He says no. He says the founder. This is a Fortune 300 company. And he said, the founder just made me chairman of the board, and so I'm going to be executive chairman, and so I can't join another board because I'm still going to be working. Even though I'm retired, I'm the executive chairman now, and the founder's going to retain the CEO title. And so a few years went by, and all of a sudden I noticed that the founder was now giving up the CEO title and taking back the title of chairman of the board. So I sent an email to my friend. I said, hey, can you join a board now? And he said, well, not exactly. He said, I've been demoted to vice chairman now, but I'm still doing all the work.
Oh, boy. So that's really, really interesting. And so, Kathleen, I'm wondering if you might also have any stories to share about this process. And in particular, I'm interested to hear about strategies that really kind of help the director make a graceful exit. It can be a very difficult situation. In some cases, it's not that difficult because sometimes the director is like, yep, I've been looking for a way to get off of this thing. So sometimes that happens, but, sometimes it's not that way. And so what are some strategies to make it a bit less embarrassing or terrible for the director?
It's really a good question. So the one I'm thinking of, without naming any names, the lead director took the charge of removing the director, and he didn't even have a chance to say goodbye to the rest of the directors. He was literally gone at the next board meeting because of the way he conducted himself. So that did not save him any embarrassment. He had the embarrassment of not being able to say goodbye to his colleagues. Let's see. In another situation, director was removed, and this is with the input of the CEO and chairman of the board, and he was, I think more gracefully exited because he did have an opportunity to say goodbye. I think there's no one right way. It depends on the circumstances. In my first example, it was a very embarrassing situation for the director and for the rest of the board. So it was important that it happened very quickly, and we just all moved on. So I think there's not one right approach. It really does depend on the circumstances.
Yeah, and I completely agree, and I don't, of course, know anything about the circumstances, Kathleen, that you're talking about there, because it might have been unavoidable. But if it was avoidable, it's like firing an employee, and then even though it's not necessary, and this is a very compliant employee that in all other regards, and it's having the security officer publicly escort them to their desk while they pack their box and escort them out. If that's not necessary for real security reasons, don't do it. And so it may have been necessary just to escort them out, and I've certainly seen situations like that. But if it can be avoided and can be handled in a much more cordial, respectful manner, then that's my advice, because you don't need to make enemies. You need to improve the company, but you don't need to make enemies and embarrass people unnecessarily.
I think that's really good guidance, and I think you're right. It certainly is very contextual, and obviously there can be lots of different reasons that a departure needs to take place, and so it certainly is, based on the circumstances. I'd like to actually take a question from the audience. We have an interesting question that kind of goes back a couple steps to the research from PwC and asking about, this interplay between the pressure coming to boards from activist shareholders and from investors based on the results of the annual director assessment. And it was just really kind of a very perfunctory question, but I think a really good one, which is, how do investors actually get their hands on the results of those annual director assessments? Is that a U.S. disclosure requirement? Where are they seeing the results of these board evaluations so that they can use those results to apply pressure? I just love to hear your thoughts about that. Kathleen, maybe you want to start, and then Dennis, I'll ask you to weigh in as well.
It's a disclosure requirement.
So they are just basically getting that directly from the disclosure.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And have you had experience, either of you, with that exact thing happening, where there's something that pops up in the board evaluation results that then comes to the attention from investors or from shareholders?
I have not.
Nor have I. And of course, in a private company situation, there's generally 99% of the time, there's no obligation to share the results. And of course, in both cases, public or private, it's really a matter of what's the context of the evaluations that are being done. Because you can meet minimal regulatory requirements with an evaluation that doesn't name any names, it doesn't get very specific, it can be very, very general, and you may still be meeting the regulatory requirements, but even shareholders getting a hold of that, there's practically zero information there anyway, so it kind of depends.
It's really kind of interesting. I mean, I wonder, again, this is somewhat of a different result this year from previous years, and so maybe it really is something that, some investors are paying closer attention to use as leverage to request some changes to happen in board composition. But I'm curious to know your thoughts on whether this is more of a perceived pressure than an actual pressure. I don't know what you think about that, but it seems like that might be the case. What do you think, Kathleen?
I think this is an actual pressure. I mean, I think there's been a lot of things happen. I mean, listen, we've had a lot of incidents at public companies that were caused by lack of attention, should we say, of the board. And those things have affected the share price, and they've affected the holders of the stock, the owners of the company. So I believe that's where the pressure is coming from, and that's where it should come from. Everybody should be should be at attention, should be doing what they're supposed to be doing. So, I think that's why the surveys are changing. I think it's right that they should be changing.
Dennis, what do you think about that? I agree, Kathleen. I think there are a lot of things happening right now that are, raising people's concerns, and so I think there certainly is some real pressure. But Dennis, do you think, especially in the private company situation, is it more perceived pressure or actual pressure? What do you think?
Well, as I address in the book and other places, when you're talking about public companies, the only definition of a public company is it's publicly traded, and there's certain regulatory specifications. With a private company, it can range from a family business that's owned by one person for the last 200 years to a venture capital startup and everything in between. So it is not one size fits all. And so, certainly under a private company that's private equity controlled, you may not have any independent board members. You may, but it's going to be generally dominated by a private equity firm. They're going to want to know everything. If you've got a wide variety of outside shareholders, no controlling shareholder that's not part of management, then there's probably much less information made available to public shareholders. And so there can be pressure, but there may be no legal obligation to succumb to that pressure. So that's a situation as well. I think in general, my perspective on this is that I think the times are changing, and there's much more of a building pressure across all varieties of social interaction and commerce for more transparency. And I think this and all the things that are happening with boards are now more of a function are becoming more of a function of that overall drive for transparency. And I think generally it's a good thing. It can be dangerous sometimes if that transparency gets into things for a company that really are proprietary and of value and shouldn't be released, but that's a whole different subject.
That's Dottie, I just want to hop in. That's a very interesting comment that Dennis has just made. Increasing the public's demand for increased transparency, particularly when you have people who are presumably sitting on a board of directors because they are in an oversight capacity of a public company, which is not owned by them, but is owned by a lot of others. And they've not shown themselves to be responsible for what's transpired. So I think that the pressure that is happening is absolutely justified.
And I think it's interesting because, to what Kathleen is saying, that to give you guys a little credit, a diligent board member, a little play on words there, a diligent board member would be sensitive to the status of the company on whose board they sit and their shareholders. Specifically, are they getting pressure for more transparency from their own shareholders? And then at a higher level, they would be sensitive to a broader social trend or, a broader trend for transparency among company shareholders in general, not specifically theirs. And if they're responsible board members following their fiduciary responsibilities properly, then they would be evaluating the need or increased need for transparency of their own company and their own board in response to those pressures, and they would be making an informed judgment as should we give more information or is it dangerous to the company to give more information. They would be making an informed judgment on what's the best approach for that company.
I think that makes a lot of sense. So we have a few minutes left here, and we've got a number of good questions coming in from the audience, but I want to move forward a little bit to talk a bit more deeply about roles. I think we've touched on some of this already in terms of, just kind of the individual roles that people play in the event of a board departure. And I know we talked about the chairperson or the lead director really taking the con on the process, and particularly with the assistance of the Nom/Gov committee. I'm curious to ask, and maybe I'll start with Kathleen, how do you see that process being different when the person that needs to be removed is, in fact, the lead director or the chairperson? I don't know if you've had experience with that situation, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about the right approach and what roles people should play in that eventuality.
I have never been in that situation. I think it would be quite an awful situation to be in. And I'm not quite sure who would, one looks to the lead director to be whose credentials and behavior is impeccable. So I suppose you would look to another strong person of strong character on the board, perhaps to take to take a role as lead. I would determine it based on the character of the individuals on the board. I can't imagine being in a situation where the lead director needed to be removed, because I don't know what they're, I can't imagine what they would be doing. But actually, I shouldn't say that, because in this environment, it could be anything.
Yeah, I was going to say there's been a few headlines recently that might give us an indication of things that could happen. So, you just never know. Dennis, I'm curious to know your thoughts about this, and I'm also wondering, maybe from both of you, is this a right role for maybe the audit committee chair? But Dennis, what do you think? What happens if it's the lead director that needs to be removed?
Well, maybe I'm missing something, but I think you guys may be overthinking it a little bit, because by definition, if there's a lead, or I like presiding director, then that's the lead or presiding director of the independent directors, which means that there's a chairman. The chairman may not be independent, which is why there's a lead director, but there's a chairman. It's the chairman's responsibility to drive this process, and obviously assigning certain responsibilities to the nom-gov to work out the details. But if there's a lead director, that means that they're not the chairman, so there's got to be a chairman, and so I would say it's that chairman's responsibility. Now, in that comment, I'm recognizing that probably one of the most serious board issues today is the leadership exhibited by chairmen. Now, there's lots and lots of good chairmen of boards, but there are many that don't exhibit the kind of leadership and the kind of guidance that they should, and that's a serious flaw. This is a case where that needs to be exerted, in my opinion.
I think that's helpful, yeah, and certainly that's true, right? You may have a complete separation between that lead director who's really focusing on outside directors and the chairperson, so there could certainly be a division of roles there. I'm interested to talk a little bit about the role of the CEO in departures. Is there a role for the CEO? What is that role, if there is one? What do you think about that? So, Kathleen, I'll start with you, and then Dennis, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
So I have one example where the CEO wanted the director removed, and the CEO happened to be the chairman of the board, and so the director was removed. The director was removed because his opinion on the strategic direction of the company was at odds with the rest of the board and with the CEO. So that's the only one example I have to share. So in that case, the CEO was active in the removal of the director.
I'm chuckling because I've been removed under exactly the same circumstances. I've also been removed from boards because in private companies, because there was a component of investors that venture capitalists in this case that gained, this is more than once, many times, where they gained voting control over a company, and they didn't want an additional opinion around the table, which as an independent director I was trying to provide. And so I was politely removed by venture capitalists who usually worked through the CEO to expedite that. But I've been I've been the subject of both those myself. So, but my answer to your question would be that it really depends on the CEO's role. Is the CEO an outside CEO that was brought in? Is he a significant shareholder? Is he on the board? Is he also chairman of the board? So at the max is Kathleen's situation, where the CEO is on the board and he is the chairperson, and my guess would be also a reasonably decent-sized shareholder, although probably not necessarily controlling shareholder. And so it's not wrong for the CEO to lead that role, but that means that there's going to be an issue there, because if the other board members, particularly other independent board members, feel that the removal of that lead director then compromises the independent nature of the board, particularly under Sarbanes-Oxley, then that creates an issue for the other independent directors, and that could end up prompting them to resign from the board if they don't feel that the board represents the independent views any longer. On the other hand, if the CEO is not on the board, he's a hired CEO, he's whatever the circumstances, then I think at minimum that the best practice would be after the board determines, and the CEO may have given some input in terms of, hey, that board member's really not helping me at all, but whatever the circumstances that led up to that, then for the chairman or lead director or whoever else was involved in leading this effort to at least consult with the CEO, inform them of what's happening, and get some feedback from them on how it would affect the business, and then also, obviously, some feedback from them on a potential replacement for that person. So it really kind of depends on the circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's exceptionally good guidance. And I do want to ask a question that came in from a member of our audience about the lead director, kind of going back a step. And I thought it was kind of an interesting question. How would you recommend that the lead director accumulate the kind of personal power required to have refreshing conversations with out-of-gas directors? So, not necessarily the removal role, but, how do they kind of build that political capital, if you will, to sit down with directors that they see are just really not contributing in the way that they need to be, and sort of have a sit-down one-on-one with them? Kathleen, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, it's usually the person. So the person in the lead director role is, how should we say this? The person with the strong character and best board demeanor. There's a reason that they're in the lead director. There's a reason they're in the lead director role to begin with. The most with a lot of wisdom. So that person is usually the one who, how do they build capital? It's up to them personally to have a good working relationship both in the boardroom and outside the boardroom with each individual independent director, and they need to cultivate that on their own. So that's how they would build the capital. That's how they would build the capital with a person, with each individual independent director, and then if there was an issue with one that needed to be removed, then there would be a history there.
Hey, I think that makes a lot of sense. And then I do want to pose a different question, if you don't mind, Dennis, to you that came in from the audience as well, kind of going back to, again, some of the data that we saw from PwC about the criticality of a strong group dynamic, and that one of the main reasons why directors might feel a colleague needs to be removed is that they are, sort of poisoning that strong dynamic. And so this person is asking, are there specific ways to really assess group dynamics to determine whether or not the team is functioning at a high quality? How do you assess it?
Well, that's interesting. There's emotional assessment and then maybe technical assessment, just to pick a couple of words out. But one of the first things that occurred to me is how often is the entire agenda of the board meeting derailed because of the grandstanding or soapboxing of a particular director, to the detriment of staying on topic, getting business done, having enough time left to talk about the strategic issues that the board wants to talk about? How often is, and how many board meetings is that totally derailed because one director finds the need to say something? I comment all the time. The best directors I know are the ones that never say anything if the director before them said it already. And then there's the directors that no matter how many other people have said the same thing, they find it necessary to repeat it in just saying, I agree with Bob. And so technically that's one way of telling. But the other is the feeling. If you leave a board meeting and you leave a board meeting frustrated and annoyed and stressed out because of the tension in the room, then that's the emotional side of the detection. But I want to circle back for a second in terms of the lead director role, and I would just emphasize that best practices is that lead director is elected by the independent directors to be their leader, as in the same manner as the chairman theoretically should be elected by the entire board, unless, of course, there's a controlling shareholder or a CEO that says, nope, I'm in charge here. I'm the major shareholder. I'm going to be the CEO and the chairman. But so you can't say, I want your respect, please bring it right now because this is what we're going to do. You have to, it's earned and it's given to you. It's not taken from the other board members. And you have to have their respect. You have to have a collaborative, the best lead directors have a collaborative demeanor, and they also tend to be more on the side of mediators than they are, ordering people around. And they have to have a sense of, I feel they have to have a good sense of governance so they can do that in an acceptable manner. But so I hope they answer your question is somewhere in there.
Absolutely. No, I think those are some really terrific thoughts. Well, this hour has just flown by, so I'm going to turn it back over to David to wrap us up, but we are at time. So thank you both so much. This has been absolutely terrific.
I agree, Dottie. This was a wonderful discussion. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Kathleen and Dottie, for putting together such a great conversation. I'd also like to thank Diligent for their sponsorship of this wonderful webinar. I hope you've enjoyed today's webinar, and we look forward to having you attend our next event, and we'll send out emails when that is scheduled. At this point, you may now all hang up and enjoy the rest of your day. This webinar is done. Thank you.